Thanks, Dave, and thanks to all of you for coming. It's a pleasure to see you here and a pleasure to be with you this evening. I was in Oklahoma City last night speaking to an AU chapter there, and as you might imagine, they have some challenges down in Oklahoma, some issues they've been dealing with. So whenever you feel a little discouraged about your situation here, remember there are states where they really are being assaulted on all sides, and Oklahoma is one of them. Yesterday was Constitution Day. Now, when it comes to holidays, this is not exactly the 4th of July. Some of you may not have even known this was happening. It tends to be a little bit of an obscure holiday. It's one of our more modern holidays, and I don't think anybody actually gets the day off or anything. But one interesting facet of Constitution Day is that public schools at all levels, from elementary schools all the way up to colleges, are required to spend at least part of the day talking about some facet of the Constitution. And since we did celebrate that yesterday, I just want to read to you a quote from the father of the Constitution, James Madison. "There is not a shadow of a right in the general government to intermeddle with religion. Its least interference with it would have been a most flagrant usurpation. I can appeal to my uniform conduct on this subject, that I have warmly supported religious freedom." That's James Madison writing in his personal journal, June 12th, 1788. Now, James Madison, here's a little thought experiment I want you to engage in with me for a second. What would happen if James Madison had a fight with Constantine the Great? Now, you might think, well, that's kind of a strange question. I mean, they're both dead. They didn't even live at the same time. But let's say they had a fight. Now, if they had a physical fight, with fists and punching and that kind of thing, it really wouldn't be much of a contest. Constantine the Great, according to the ancient sources, was a pretty powerful guy. The historian Eusebius tells us that no one was comparable to him for grace and beauty of person or height of stature. And he so far surpassed his peers in personal strength to be a terror to them. That's Constantine. Now, Madison, when people talk about Madison, scholars of his day, the words they use are things like sickly, frail, small. Not exactly a real powerful guy. So had it been a contest of brawn, Madison would have ended up on the bad end of things. But they had to fight. And it wasn't a contest of brawn, it was a contest of brain. And because it was a contest of brain, Madison came out on top. So you have those two visions of religious liberty there. Constantine's vision, the idea of the church and the state sort of being combined, the state directing the activities of the church or the church directing the activities of the state. The idea that the state has a favorite religion, and if you support that religion, if you're a member of it, well, good for you. You're going to reap the benefits of that. If not, well, you may be in for a hard time of it. That's the Constantine vision. The Madison vision is quite different. Religious and philosophical freedom for everybody. Christians and non-Christians, believers and non-believers. The right to make these decisions for yourself and the right of conscience being protected and resting on a secular state. Now, when we look at those two visions, okay? All right. Okay. When we look at those two visions, we can see that, one is clearly superior. I mean, I would hope we would say that. We would understand that. But it's an unpleasant and kind of unexpected fact of our life that even though Madison's vision is superior, there have always been people who prefer the vision of Constantine. And they have been very vocal. They've been very active. They have been present in our political system for a number of years, and many of them hold power today. But lately they have been troubled. And our world has changed. Our world has changed. American society has changed and is changing. And this has led to something of a kind of crisis of faith, if you will. Now, I want to be careful about what I mean by that term, a crisis of faith. I don't mean that people are turning away from faith, or that people are no longer interested in religion, or that people decided that they don't care anymore, because comparing the United States to other Western nations, you still see a great interest in religious things and spiritual things. Western European nations, many of them, there is a lot of rising tide of non-belief or disinterest in religion, and some churches have been sort of turned into museums. That's not the case here. But there is a situation where people are sort of, and I'll talk about this a little bit more in detail, people are changing their religious perspective and their philosophical perspective to a degree that some religious institutions are starting to feel a bit of a crisis of faith in their own faith. Now, what I mean by that is simple. For a long time, the religious organizations in the United States were very proud of what they had achieved. They sometimes built an entire denomination up from the ground. They built houses of worship. They had missions. They had social service programs. They had various outreach. And many of them still do. And many of them are very happy to pay for this and support all of this with money and support that they get from people sitting in the pews. But some denominations and some religious leaders are feeling the stress of the change. And they are starting to look to you and look to the taxpayer and look to the public to support their religious endeavors. And we see this play out in many different ways. One example is the question of religious education and religious schools. More and more demands for taxpayer funding for those school systems. Sometimes we even have situations where churches will demand taxpayer support because their structure has been damaged after a storm or something like that. We see issues of religious symbols ripping through our culture. Religious organizations demanding the right to put their symbols at the seat of government, as if they didn't have the power to support them through private means anymore. We see disputes over issues of prayer at government meetings, and again, some of these conservative religious groups demanding that their prayer be the one that the government holds up for everyone in the community. We see organizations demanding the right to display their religious symbols in front of the courthouse or the city hall or the state house, again, as if they didn't have the power to do that through private channels. And I would submit that even the dispute over hospital mergers, which you're going through here, is another manifestation of this. A very restrictive form of directives being imposed on everyone indirectly by the state. If they were so great, if they were so wonderful, people would voluntarily accept these directives, but in fact they don't. They resist them. So churches seek to impose them on folks in other ways. For a long time, the guiding principle of religion in the country was we will support our faith on our own. And people took joy and pleasure in the fact that they did that. And make no mistake, there are still many religious leaders who hold to that point of view, that they're proud of what they achieve, they're proud of their private funding, they're proud to be able to take that out into the arena with their own money. But there are some religious leaders who feel differently. And the argument they seem to be making is, we can't build this thing, this religious thing, without your help. Or, we build it, but it's broken, and you have to help us fix it. Or, we can't keep it going, we build it, but we can't keep it going without your taxpayer help. And a good example of this that I mentioned is Roman Catholic education. Let me give you some interesting statistics. In 1960, there were 5.2 million children attending 13,000 Catholic schools in the United States, 1960. 2006, which was the most recent figure I could find, there were 2 million students attending 6,600 Catholic schools in the United States. And we've seen Catholic schools closing recently in cities like New York and Buffalo, Chicago, Philadelphia, and so on. Now, what happened? I mean, not all of that can be attributed to demographics and changes in the birth rate. Some of it was caused by people simply deciding that they don't necessarily want to use Catholic education anymore. There are many reasons for that. In some communities, people simply looked around and said, we have very good public schools in our community. Don't want to spend this extra money. Or people said, I would rather put this money into a college fund because, as we know, the cost of a college education continues to increase at a very dramatic rate. And as someone who has a daughter in college, I can testify that that's a very alarming thing. So people are saying, we'll put the money into that instead. Or, most interestingly, some people have simply decided they don't have to listen to the bishop anymore. When I was a kid, and I grew up in an Irish Catholic area of western Pennsylvania, large family, lower middle class, as they say euphemistically, we had this idea that the bishop told you to do something. Well, you really did it. I mean, you didn't question what the bishop was saying. So when the bishop said, find a way to send your children to the Catholic school system, that's what families did. Well, now fewer and fewer people are saying, well, I don't really have to listen to everything down the line just because the bishop says. And that sort of spirit and that philosophy has kind of ripped through some other issues that we're going to be talking about tonight that I'll be discussing with you. On social policy, for example. The idea that you don't necessarily have to listen to the dogma of a faith right down the line. Now, the reaction to that from some of the conservative religious leaders has been kind of interesting. Faced with this sort of new idea, new way of thinking, this recalcitrance on the part of people, their response hasn't been to change their message or to fine-tune it or make it more attractive to people. It has been instead to rely on force, to say, we failed to persuade you, so now we will force you. And we see this playing out on issues like LGBT rights, birth control, creationism versus evolution in the schools, censorship, compelled worship and prayer, all these issues that are just rippling through our society, that are part of what people call the culture wars. What ties all of this together? What underlies all of it is the belief, the insistence that someone feels or some group feels that they have to make moral decisions for you. A good example of this is the birth control cases. We've had these reach the Supreme Court. We know what the court has said, and we're dealing with the fallout from that now. One of the things that bothers me about the current Supreme Court, and there are a lot of things that bother me about the current Supreme Court, one of the things that bothers me most is that they don't seem to be terribly interested in factual data. One of the things I've noticed about the community of individuals who support separation of church and state, whether they're coming from a non-religious humanistic perspective or a progressive Christian or Jewish or Hindu or Muslim or whatever approach they're taking, is that they tend to respect the role of facts in this type of discussion and feel that the way people behave and the way people live their lives and facts, that ought to somehow impact these debates, that it should be relevant. But unfortunately, the Supreme Court, it's often not. Let me give you some facts that I think are very relevant to this debate about access to birth control. The first fact is that, and I don't want to surprise anybody in the room, I'm going to cover your ears if you feel offended, but people have sex. 95% of all Americans have sex before marriage. That comes from the Guttmacher Institute, which is a group in New York that does some of the best social studies research about human sexuality. 95%. And that's not really a new figure. I mean, that's not really a new phenomenon. It's been going on for quite a while. So 95% are engaging in sexual activity before marriage. The second piece of information that's interesting to this debate is family size, because this has changed somewhat over the years. If you ask women today who want to have a family, who want to have children, what they think the best number of children to have is, if you asked them that maybe 50 or 60 years ago, they might maybe said 4 or 5. But now they say 2. So, 2 children. That's the second piece of information. 2 children being the ideal family for most women, when asked. Third piece of information deals with fertility. When do women become fertile? When do they stop being fertile? Well, usually in your teen years, and that will continue into the 40s, and maybe beyond in some cases, but essentially you're talking about a fairly long period of time there. What does this all mean? Well, it means that over the course of her life, the average woman is going to spend a lot more time trying to avoid pregnancy than get pregnant. That's where birth control comes into play. It is a well-settled principle, and has been for a long time in this country legally, that the government can override an asserted religious claim if it has a compelling state interest. And for a long time, we had this understanding that assuring women's access to birth control, protecting that access, making that available so that people could make their own decisions about these things, was indeed a compelling state interest. When the Supreme Court handed down the Hobby Lobby rulings, they actually said, yeah, it is a compelling state interest, but there's this other factor we have to consider, that the government could do other things to, obviously offending this microphone in some way, that the government could do other things to assure this access to birth control. But, we have to ask ourselves, once this door's open, what other medical treatments and what other medical conditions will be subjected to somebody's religious veto? The Jehovah's Witnesses don't believe in blood transfusions. So if your boss is a Jehovah's Witness, can he now say that we're not going to pay for any surgical operations that might include blood transfusions? What if your boss is a fundamentalist Christian and believes that you shouldn't get a vaccine because that's showing a lack of faith in Jesus? What if your boss is a Scientologist? Scientologists have a well-known fight with the psychiatric profession. So could your boss cut off your access to the drugs you may need to treat depression or ADHD or lots of other types of drugs that people really rely on every day? What about counseling, marriage counseling, personal counseling? All these types of things could be jeopardized. Now, the Supreme Court, of course, when they handed down the Hobby Lobby rulings, we're just dealing with birth control here. We're not addressing those other things. Well, not that day they weren't. But whenever the court sets down a broad rule like that, whenever the court throws open a door like that, people run through that door. They try to press the argument. In fact, we're already seeing some fallout from the Hobby Lobby. People taking the legal theory that was enunciated in that opinion and pressing it into other areas, and the results here have not been good. So it's troubling. And what's especially frustrating about this, to go back to the birth control issue, is that if you know your history, you know how hard we had to fight to get that right in the first place. Now, there are people in the room who lived through that. I've read about it, but there are people in this room who lived through that. In many states, until the mid-1960s, it was illegal for doctors to not only prescribe birth control, but to discuss it with couples. So in Connecticut, for example, a married couple could go to their doctor and say, well, we'd like to engage in family planning. We'd like to have a small family. What are our options? And the doctor couldn't tell them legally. It was against the law because the power of the Catholic Church in that case was so strong. They had these laws on the books. Now, a woman named Estelle Griswold decided to test that. And she enlisted the help of Dr. Lee Buxton at Yale Medical School. And they opened a clinic in New Haven to distribute information about birth control. Just information. They were not handing out any devices or medicines or pills. It was only information. But even that was seen as such a threat to the ruling religious establishment of Connecticut that they called the DA, and the next thing that happened was that facility was raided, and Ms. Griswold and Dr. Buxton were arrested. Now that is exactly what they wanted to have happen, because they wanted to take it into court. And they did, and they won. And the Supreme Court, a few years after that, extended the right to use birth control to unmarried couples as well. So we really had to fight hard to get that right established and break the clerical domination that had just lorded it over that issue for so long. And it's disturbing today to see that being eroded in any way, knowing how hard we had to fight to get that right. And to see it happening on the grounds of religious freedom is even more disturbing. And I go back to something I said earlier. Those who hold to a confident faith don't feel the need to use the power of the government to impose it on others. They lead by and they persuade by example. If the beliefs of the Hobby Lobby individuals and the people on that corporation are sincere, and I don't doubt that they are, maybe they could do a better job explaining them to their employees and persuade them to adopt their point of view. But they seem to be worried that their argument isn't strong enough, isn't persuasive enough, isn't maybe realistic enough, I would say. And instead, they have turned to this complicated mechanism of trying to shut that access off. They aren't interested in persuading by example. Why not? Well, probably because in many cases, their examples aren't very good. I have tracked the religious right and followed these organizations for more than a quarter of a century, which sometimes is hard for me to believe, but that's what I've been doing professionally. And I've been going to their meetings, and I visit their websites, and I read their publications. I debate their spokespeople on television. And what I have observed is what they are offering to us isn't very good. It's anger and it's bitterness. It's conspiracy theory thinking. It's hate and it's rage. It's division. And most importantly, it's designed to make you afraid of somebody. You know, whoever the enemy du jour is. Maybe the enemy of the day is feminists. Maybe the enemy of the day is Muslims. Maybe the enemy of the day is secular humanists. Whoever they've decided. They've used all of these different arguments over the years to keep people afraid of some sort of insidious force that supposedly is undermining our society. When I was in Oklahoma last night, I said, you know, you guys had a really, really close call with that Sharia thing, because remember they actually passed a constitutional amendment in Oklahoma to ban Islamic law, because, you know, the Muslims had just about taken over Oklahoma. It was really, they were just on the verge. There's something like less than 0.5% of the population, but they were going to do it. And that amendment was declared unconstitutional, and rightly so. The First Amendment protects us, or should protect us, from all imposition of religious law. So where does this leave us? Where do we stand? Well, you know, the change that's occurring, the changes that are occurring in society, the changes that are occurring to religion, the changes that are even occurring politically, how people live their lives, it has a lot of folks worried on the other side of this, a lot of folks afraid. They see this, they look at the religious complexion, and they're worried that they are losing out. And they should be worried, because I do think they're losing out. If you look at what's kind of happening religiously in the country, and I'm not a sociologist of religion, but I've tried to keep up with the current data, and it's very interesting. As I said earlier, the interest in religion is there. That's not going away, although the number of self-professed non-believers has risen somewhat, Most Americans say they're still spiritual, they're still interested in religion. You hear a lot of people these days, though, say things like, I'm spiritual but not religious. It's a phrase that's become very common. And that says something about the way people are thinking. People are, generally speaking, more open to a broader religious experience. One that is open to, say, the blending of traditions. Some people may say, well, I was raised a whatever, and I like certain aspects of that, but I've also been influenced by some Eastern religion that I've read about and my spouse's faith, which is different, and I take some of that, and we blend this together with other things we've read, and we are interested in this kind of do-it-yourself spirituality. In a country that separates church and state, that maximizes freedom of conscience, people feel very confident engaging in that type of experimentation. And we're seeing a lot of that today. People listening less to the rigid voice of a dogmatic cleric and more to a voice that comes from inside themselves. In a book, a voice that may consider a book like the Bible to be, an interesting collection of stories, some metaphor, maybe some history, but not necessarily a step-by-step instruction guide for how to live your life. This new credo is more tolerant. It says live and let live, and it dares to suggest that for those who believe in an afterlife, there may be more than one pathway there. Now, you can see what that would be threatening to a fundamentalist. I mean, the fundamentalist still clinging to this very rigid idea that their dogma is the only true path, the only one way. And the thing I find most interesting about that is, if you get 5 fundamentalists in a room, you'll get 5 different paths, 5 different one ways there. I mean, they don't even agree among themselves. Yet they'll speak very arrogantly with the authority that they do. And they would try to impose this on us as much as we can. So this is causing the theocrats among us, the would-be theocrats, I think a lot of sleepless nights as they stare into the face of this changing religious landscape. And again, what has their reaction to that been? Has it been to modify their message, preach a better sermon, offer a better product? No, it has not. It has been instead to cry persecution whenever they are challenged, and to demand preferential treatment from the government. On that latter point, I would refer you to Ben Franklin, who said in a letter to Richard Price, October 9th, 1780, the following: "When a religion is good, I conceive that it will support itself. When it cannot support itself, and God does not take care to support it, so that its professors are obliged to call upon the help of the civil power, it is a sign I apprehend of it being a bad one." Now, I mentioned earlier these 2 visions of separation of church and state. They've always been with us. The secular state that protects the right of conscience for all. Secularism in this vision is not a dirty word. It is not a corrosive force. It is not a bad thing. It is a positive, good thing. And it is not at war with religious freedom. It is a partner of religious freedom, because on the secular state rests that wall of separation, rests that right of conscience, rests the right of all of us to decide what religion, if any, we will affiliate with, pay for, and support. That's the vision. The second vision, state has a favorite religion. You share it. You reap the benefits and the rewards. But if you don't, maybe you're tolerated at best, but you are still open to persecution, or you have some religion imposed upon you through various state mechanisms. Your children may encounter it in the public school system. You may be forced to pay taxes to support these faiths. You may see these symbols of the dominant faith reflected in public life, government especially. Well, why, when the choice is so stark and clear, are so many seduced by the second vision? Well, I think we have to look a little deeper. We have to look a little deeper, and especially the changes in society that have occurred, say in the past 50 or 60 years. We've been through a lot of rights movements. We had a civil rights movement. We had a women's rights movement. We had a gay rights movement. And now we even have non-believers pressing for their rights. So we have these rights movements. And some people, most people, I think, look at this and say, well, those were tough times to go all through those rights movements. They were difficult, but we're a better nation for it. We're extending the rights and freedoms to lots of different groups. We're trying to include everybody. That's a positive good. But there are some who look at those rights movements and say, it's too much, it's too fast, it's too quickly. Especially with LGBT rights. I want to take a few minutes to talk about that, because that's, I think, a very illustrative example of how things are changing and how quickly they're changing, and why some people are so frightened by that. Now, if someone had told me, 15 years ago, that we would have same-sex marriage legalized in as many states as we do right now, I don't think I would have believed it. It just didn't seem like the society was ready for that yet. I mean, we were moving in a more tolerant direction on gay rights generally, I think. We were moving toward more acceptance. But marriage, that seemed like kind of a longer-term goal. And even many gay rights activists felt that way. Yet here we are. And you see same-sex marriage legal in an increasing number of states. Even my home state of Pennsylvania, which, despite the fact that it tends to vote, Democratic in presidential elections, it can be very culturally conservative. James Carville once famously reflected that Pennsylvania was Philadelphia and Pittsburgh with Mississippi in the middle. And coming from the Mississippi part, I can tell you that that's true. There's a lot of cultural conservatism there, but there is same-sex marriage now. So when you look at this change, when you look at this wave, really, there are a couple ways to deal with it. One way is to simply accommodate it, get used to it, accept it. Another way is to dig in and fight and to just say you're going to try to stop it. And more, what we're seeing from fundamentalist religions is an attempt to fight it and to base their argument on the doctrine of religious freedom. And this is very disturbing to me, especially because they often attempt to dress up a shabby doctrine of discrimination in the noble garment of religious freedom. And I can give you an example of that you may have heard about in Arizona. There was a law proposed some months ago that basically would have allowed the owner of a for-profit business to refuse service to anybody if they felt that that person's lifestyle offended their religious beliefs. Now, who do you think, what class of individuals do you think that this law was aimed at? Presbyterians, right? No. They were talking about gays, lesbians, transgender. They did not want to have to serve those individuals. Now, for a lot of people, looking at that and seeing that law and listening to the debate, it was a little uncomfortable because it reminded a lot of folks of a time in our society when we told an entire class of individuals, business owners had a legal right to tell an entire class of individuals, you can't come in here. Your hotel, for you people, that's across town. The restaurants that serve you, your kind, they're over there. You can't come in here. And we heard that argument raised. I mean, that's how it used to be in our society. We moved beyond that, yet here it looked like we were trying to go back to that, and religious freedom was being used as the justification. Interestingly enough, what killed that law was the business community. Governor Jan Brewer of Arizona is not exactly a liberal, if any of you know about her. She's a pretty conservative governor. Yet the business community said, wait a minute here, we don't really want to be the state that's telling people not to come here. They're not welcome, not to come here for tourism, not to spend their money here. And that sort of turned things around. But that law, versions of it, are being proposed and have been proposed, and even slightly modified versions of it have passed in a few states. So the battle is still out there. We have a thing in this country called a public accommodation law. If you are a for-profit business, generally speaking, you must serve the public. Now there are, some limitations on that. But you cannot say you're just going to exclude entire classes of people from service at your institution, at your for-profit business. And that, again, going back to the days of Jim Crow. And people trying to reestablish that and using religious freedom as their argument is very offensive to a lot of us. But what makes people want to go to extremes like that? To the point where they're actually trying to write this stuff into law. Well, a lot of it is simply that fear of that tide of change that I had mentioned, especially in the area of LGBT rights. And inside themselves, they may not admit this publicly, but inside themselves, the almost certain knowledge that they are standing on the losing side of history. Because at some point, the courts are important. What the courts say, very important. The courts have done a lot to push this forward, but the culture is pushing too. Sometimes the courts lead the culture, sometimes the culture leads the courts, but you can see the push there. And I don't know what the Supreme Court will say when it reaches them, this issue reaches them of same-sex marriage, but the culture will continue to push in a certain direction. If you look at the polling data, especially for younger people, this is not even a question for them. They're very much in favor of the idea of marriage equality. So the culture is going to push that thing through. Now, imagine if the fundamentalists see that tide of change, observe that wave coming at them, the fear that they feel, the anger, the rage. They'll grasp at anything, including trying to draft a noble doctrine like religious freedom to cover their discrimination. But I don't think in the end run it'll work. They'll keep talking, but the train is pretty much leaving the station. Now, I want to talk about a couple of other issues before I wrap up. And one is the case that we had in New York and Greece. Some of you are familiar with this case. We had a situation where we brought this matter into the court concerning prayers before city council meetings in the suburb of Rochester, Greece, New York. They were almost always Christian, the prayers. In fact, they only went and found a couple of non-Christian prayer givers to appear before the council after we complained at Americans United. They went out and they found a couple of folks. But they obviously weren't going to stop this practice of almost always having Christian prayers until they were sued. Now, we sued and we actually won the case in the first couple levels of court, but when it went to the Supreme Court, and unfortunately the court did agree to hear it, they reversed, and it was a 5-4 decision, as they so often are these days. And that was very depressing, but after the depression, we kind of got angry, because looking at the decision, you can see again how out of touch with reality it is. I mentioned earlier how sometimes the Supreme Court seems to be out of touch with reality. Well, think about this for a minute. Justice Kennedy, who wrote the opinion in that case, said that it really wasn't a problem because adults have the right to leave the room if they don't want to participate in the prayer. Now, most people who go to a city council meeting or a county council meeting are not going there because it's a fascinating way to spend the evening. They're going because they want something. Maybe they want sidewalks fixed in their neighborhood or better lighting or what have you. They want something. They want to present a petition to the local government, the government that is the closest to the people. I mean, you cannot usually walk into state legislatures, and you certainly can't do it in Congress with your petition for whatever you want, but you can at the local government many times. So we are to believe that the individual who wants something from the county or the city council is going to offend the council, first of all, by walking out on their prayer, doing so publicly in front of everybody, and then come back in 5 minutes later and say, oh, by the way, would you do this thing for me? It's not going to happen. People are going to say, well, I guess I just have to deal with this because this is what's happening. So we've looked at the fallout from that decision. It's, again, like a lot of court rulings these days. It's a little murky, and we're asking ourselves what happens next. What we've been trying to do is ensure as much inclusion as we can at these local government meetings. Now, I would be happy for these city council members or county council members to meet in their private chambers before the meeting and do whatever they wanted to religiously. If they wanted to pray, read the Bible, get down on their knees in their private chambers, that's fine. But they seem to want to do something else. They want to come out and have their religious experience spread out toward the entire community and send the message that they are speaking on behalf of the entire community, not just themselves. And that is wrong. I think the Supreme Court obviously missed that decision. They did the wrong ruling, but we're trying to be more inclusive. So we're trying to get individuals from non-Christian communities and from non-religious communities to approach these towns and these city councils and ask for a right to speak as well. And we are also working with religious leaders of a more progressive bent who, even though they may be Christian personally, will recite an invocation that is inclusive of everybody and doesn't make anyone feel like they're being excluded. And that's probably the best we can do with this ruling right now. The second issue I want to touch upon is the hospital mergers, because I know that's been a concern to folks here in this area, and you're not alone there. We've seen this issue appearing in a number of states. What's happening is hospitals are sort of merging in many parts of the country for various economic reasons. Many hospitals in the United States are Catholic. They're run by the Catholic Church. And what happens when a Catholic hospital merges with a non-Catholic institution, the non-Catholic institution is required to accept what are called the ethical directives of the church, which deal with various medical issues. Obviously, there's no abortion in the hospital anymore. There's no distribution of birth control. Certain types of operations are no longer performed. And a lot of people don't realize this. Your end-of-life directives fall under the Catholic directives. So you may think, oh, no problem, it's cool, I've got a living will. My will states what's going to happen to me. I've got advanced directives, spells out everything I want done or don't want done. But if you're in a Catholic hospital, they don't have to abide by that. They can say, oh, sorry, our rules are that we're going to override that. So you definitely need to be aware of this. Now, there isn't a lot of case law in this area. Our attorneys have been looking at this, and we've been working on the issue along with groups like the ACLU and Merger Watch and Planned Parenthood, some of these other groups that are interested in this. We've all been kind of keeping an eye on it. There's a case from the 19th century, a Supreme Court ruling from the late 19th century, that allowed the government to give public aid to religious hospitals. So it kind of cuts the other way. And that case is often cited as justification for allowing this type of arrangement where public money is flowing into an obviously sectarian institution. But that doesn't mean that there aren't other options. In Florida, a few years ago, in the Tampa-St. Pete area, we had a situation like this where a merger was proposed, and it would have meant the loss of services for a lot of especially low-income people who relied on a public hospital that was going to merge with a Catholic system. And the ACLU, Americans United, other organizations rallied people, made them aware that they may lose these services, And that particular merger was stopped. They cut that and didn't do it. So there is that opportunity. Also, there are sometimes various midway suggestions and types of halfway measures that are proposed whereby some of the services may be moved to another facility that's technically not under control of the church, and at least services aren't lost, although it does create an additional layer of bureaucracy or an additional thing that a person must do in order to achieve or in order to get these services. So it's definitely an issue that we're concerned about. It's one that is important to a lot of people, and it's one that is touching more and more people's lives because these mergers are just occurring at an incredible rate all around the country. Our attorneys are looking at the situation here in Washington State. As I said, it's a difficult issue because of the case law. There's just not a lot of it out there. And this is not, as we know right now, looking at the Supreme Court, not a court that is very favorable to the entire concept of separation of church and state. What's very frustrating about that is that it's a one-vote situation. There are 5-4 rulings. And you know, that happens down the line in other areas as well, not just separation of church and state. When you think about some of these issues we've had to deal with lately, there have been a lot of these 5-4 rulings. So obviously, the court, very important issue that you need to be thinking about. Just due to the fact that some of the judges or justices are getting up in years, we know there are going to be changes on the court in the years to come. I mean, some of these justices just can't stay on the court much longer. So it's very important to be thinking about that. Now, our organization is nonpartisan. We're not allowed to endorse candidates or oppose candidates or get involved in politics at that level. But I can tell you that you can tell other people and remind other people how important the federal judiciary is, because it's the final word on these issues. Congress can pass a law, the president can sign it or veto it, but it's really the courts that often have the final say in these matters. And remember, how do we get our federal judges? Well, they're nominated by the president, and they're either confirmed or denied by the Senate on a strict up and down vote. 51 votes will put a judge on the federal courts. The House doesn't play a role. It's the president and the Senate. So those individuals are very important. And it does make a difference. I don't know how much you know about the federal court system, but essentially, below the Supreme Court, the nation is carved up into different circuits. There are, I think, 11 or 12 of them. And most cases stop at one of these lower courts. The Supreme Court accepts only 1.8% of all the cases it is asked to hear. 1.8%. So the odds are always against a case going all the way to the Supreme Court. I mean, in popular culture, people love to say that. You know, I'll take it all the way to the Supreme Court. Well, that's movies, that's TV. In real life, you're not going to be able to take it all the way to the Supreme Court in most cases. But nevertheless, the lower court judges are very important for that reason. The Fourth Circuit is a circuit that includes a couple of states on the East Coast, Virginia, Maryland, a couple others. And it was very conservative for a long time. And whenever we had a problem in one of those states, we were always worried because we were concerned about approaching the judges on the Fourth Circuit, in that circuit. Well, because of changes during the Obama presidency and different types of judges being nominated, retirements and so on, the Fourth Circuit is now one of the more friendly circuits to separation of church and state. There are still circuits that are very problematic, the Fifth Circuit, the 11th Circuit. But essentially, you're talking about a court that really changed because of maybe 4 or 5 judicial nominations. There are, I think, usually 15 judges on these lower panels. So, you know, you're talking about a real significant change there brought about because of a political situation. So remind people of that. Because sometimes people just, there's a disconnect. I don't know where they think these judges are coming from. They just fall out of the sky and land on the court. You know, we have to remind folks that there is a political connection. They need to be aware of that. As I wrap up, I want to just kind of say one other thing to you that kind of goes back to what I said at the beginning. You know, people sometimes say, oh, you know, maybe you're going overboard. Or is it really fair to accuse some of these groups on the religious right of favoring theocracy or advocating for this sort of thing? Let me just read something to you that I find addresses that issue pretty well. There's a group called the Alliance Defending Freedom. It's a very large religious right legal organization. It's based in Scottsdale, Arizona. It's a budget of about $35 million. And they pay for a lot of the religious rights legal work. When we were fighting that case in Greece, it was lawyers for the Alliance Defending Freedom that were taking the case on for the city of Greece. When we were fighting for access to birth control and Hobby Lobby, it was those lawyers from the Alliance Defending Freedom on the other side that were advocating there. And I always find it interesting about these organizations is their names. The Alliance Defending Freedom. If you don't know any better, that sounds pretty good. These organizations are great at picking these euphemistic names. They'll say, well, our goal is to take away the rights of gays and lesbians, and to take away women's rights, and to take away the rights of non-Christians, and we're called the Liberty Federation. And there's an old joke historians have about the Holy Roman Empire. They say there were 3 things wrong with it. It was neither holy, Roman, nor an empire. Alliance Defending Freedom has a similar problem. It's not an alliance, and it's not defending freedom, except the freedom of a fundamentalist to tell you what to do. This statement appears on their website. The Alliance Defending Freedom seeks to recover the robust Christendemic theology of the 3rd, 4th, and 5th centuries. See, you thought I was kidding about Constantine. Not kidding, all right? It's real. And that kind of brings me back full circle. As we go through this, and if we watch this all unfold, I would urge you to take these threats seriously, obviously, every time. But also, remember, despite these setbacks we've had, how much we have gained. And there, again, are people in this room who lived through those times, who know a lot about more than I do, because I've only read about them. But you may remember, for example, not only the restrictions on birth control, but the restrictions on women's rights. There's the censorship that was very common in our society. Some of you may remember how religious organizations used to have the power to ban books, magazines, movies, stage plays. When I was a kid, I was always perplexed by when people would say a book was banned in Boston. Because in my view, Boston was a cosmopolitan, liberal New England city. And, they were open to things. But as I read more and learned more, well, the reason they said that was they used to ban things in Boston. And the bishop had the power to have that done. If a movie was seen as offensive to morals or Catholic Church or what have you, they could have it removed from circulation. And it took people going to court and fighting for the right to read and to learn to overturn those types of policies. Well, they lost that battle. And they lost some of these other battles. And they've lost a lot of things. That doesn't mean they're not going to keep fighting. But whenever you get discouraged or whenever you get angry about some of these things, just remember how much they have lost and how much more they will lose if we all remain active in this area. And I just want to conclude by saying that, I think the biggest challenge we face is what I said at the beginning. Preserving the victory of Madison and fighting all of those who would give it to Constantine. Thank you.